Welcome to Casual Friday. Well, this week I really have two things to talk about. One is the August Sock Knitalong, which began yesterday, and the other is to give you an update on my current work in progress, the 1930s vintage sweater pattern. So let's get started. Yesterday was the official start day for the August Sock Knitalong. It's not too late to join in on it if you want, but what I wanted to do first was to talk a little bit about what a knit-along is and what it isn't, because there has been some confusion with some people, and I think the confusion is mostly from people who have not been in online knitting communities in the past, and perhaps their only experience online with knitting is maybe through YouTube videos like mine, and they've heard about Ravelry on my channel, or maybe even from other channels, and haven't been on Ravelry until now, and then are a little confused about navigating Ravelry, but also just how the knit-along works. My experience with knitting communities began with online knitting communities about 14 years ago. I had been on a 5-year sort of knitting hiatus where I really didn't knit very much. I certainly wasn't going to yarn shops. I was only knitting from stash if I needed a baby gift or something like that, knitting things I'd knit before. So I really didn't see anything outside of what I was already doing at home. And prior to that, I didn't know any other knitters. So it wasn't until I returned to knitting in 2005 that I discovered other knitters online, which then allowed me to meet knitters in person. So I did that in a couple of ways. And one of the ways was through these online email groups. Another thing that I was already accustomed to when I returned to knitting, because I was in online writers groups, I was in online email groups for parenting, as well as forums. And so online forums at that time often were through email. You would post an email to the group, and then everyone in the group would get that posting and they could reply to that. And then there were also these online forums where you'd actually go to a website and log in, and then you could take part in conversations there. So I was already used to all of that sort of thing when I returned to knitting and discovered that there was an online knitting magazine called Knitty. I found out about the Knitting Guild Association and the Master Hand Knitting Program, and they had online forums. And through all of that, I discovered that there were these email groups through Yahoo groups that were for knitting, and I wanted to learn how to knit socks. And because I was used to, if I was interested in something very specific and didn't know anybody in person, I was used to going to Yahoo groups and just looking for any email group that had to do with whatever it was I was interested in. And so one of the things that I was looking up was sock knitting. So when I began learning to knit socks, I joined, I think, 3 different sock groups. One was called Sock Knitters Anonymous, and these days they are on Ravelry. There's a Ravelry group called Sock Knitters Anonymous. Another group that I belong to is called 6 Socks Knitalong. And that group was where every 2 months a new sock pattern was posted, and usually there was something interesting and different about that sock pattern. It had an unusual heel, or it used an interesting stitch pattern like mosaic knitting or something like that. So there was always something to learn. The pattern was posted on the first day of the 2-month period. You could download the pattern and read through it, and then you could chat by writing these emails to the group about any questions you had, color combinations, stitch pattern that you didn't understand, or whatever it was, or how do you modify this heel if your heel is taller or shorter or whatever, how do you make modifications? So I was in this was an online community of knitters who were all chatting about the same thing. So during that 2-month period, we were all working on the same sock pattern, and we were talking to each other. And when we finished our socks, we could upload a photo. They had a little photo album in a special folder in the online setting for the group, because you could read the messages in email, but when you receive them, or you could go onto the Yahoo Group's website for that particular group, and you could read all of the messages online in that way. So there was a couple ways to do it, but there was a folder where you could upload your photos of your project, and you could see what everybody had done. So this was my first exposure to sock knitting and to knit-alongs. So 2005 is the year that YouTube was founded. So I got into these email groups about a month or so after YouTube was incorporated. Nobody knew about YouTube. Nobody was using YouTube. Certainly they weren't using it for knitting videos yet. But that gives you some context for what the time frame was. And it was several years before Ravelry as well. So this is how I learned about the concept of what a knit-along was. So during that year in 2005, I found out that there was a new group a new Yahoo knitting group being formed called Follow the Leader Erin Knitalong. And it was being run by a woman who is a master knitter, and I had just started the master hand knitting program. So I may have heard about it on the forums for the Knitting Guild Association, or I may have just heard about it in one of my sock groups. I don't know. That knit-along, the designer had picked some cable patterns for a sweater, and the idea was we were going to be knitting a top-down sweater to our own measurements. We would be adding elements that were of our choosing, the type of neck style we wanted, whether it was cardigan or pullover. We could determine how deep we wanted our sleeves and how we were going to rearrange the cables if we wanted to, or there's all sorts of things. There was a lot to learn, and it was a really good knit-along for bridging being a slave to the pattern and learning to design. So you didn't have to focus on the stitch pattern element, which is really, a different level of design when it comes to Erin patterns. All you had to focus on was sort of the shape that you wanted and the elements that you wanted, and the decisions about the stitch patterns had been made already. So I learned an awful lot, and that one was a knit-along where she released the documentation in parts. So at first it was how to do the gauge and do your measurements, and then the next section was here's an introduction to the stitch patterns, and so that and how do you swatch for the stitch patterns, and then starting to plan for the neck and how you start for this particular sweater. And then gradually the documentation was spaced further apart as you got further and further into the sweater. And the final document was probably 6 months later when she was talking about just finishing off the ribbing, which is really a personal choice in terms of what kind of ribbing you wanted and if you wanted to extend any of the stitch patterns down into the ribbing and that sort of thing. So that was my first exposure to a knit-along. It was all based on through email, and everybody was either working on the same pattern or the same type of project that was related. So Ravelry came along in 2007, and with that, right away, there were knit-alongs that people were doing on Ravelry. There were groups that are devoted to knit-alongs, or designers, when they release a new pattern, might have a knit-along, and it's a way to sort of promote interest in the pattern, get a lot of people at the beginning to knit the pattern, and post their pictures. Because when you are shopping for a pattern on Ravelry, a lot of times you look to see how many projects there are, and you want to look at the photos because you want to see, can people knit this thing and have it turn out decently? Are they writing notes that say, oh, this pattern is very confusing, or this pattern is really great, or here's how I modified this pattern? So so a lot of times a designer will run a knit-along in conjunction with releasing a new pattern. Not always. And then there are Ravelry groups that are devoted, that are really fan groups for specific designers. I really liked the sock designs of Cookie A. I don't think she's designing anymore, but she wrote 2 books. And I remember when either the first or second book came out, there was a knit-along group for the patterns in her book. And so they would select a new 2 patterns from the book every month. They'd have an easier one and a more difficult one. And everybody would be talking about what yarn they were using, and they would post their progress photos and things. So this wasn't a knit-along that was run by the designer, but it was run by people who really liked it. Often with knit-alongs, there are prizes. When I was doing them in the email groups, there certainly weren't, but in Ravelry, often there are prizes associated with it. They get donations from yarn companies, or in the case of the vintage knitting group that I'm a member of, they have a 6-month long knit along. So they have the first half of the year and it has some sort of theme. I joined in on it this year. The theme was sort of underappreciated patterns. So they were looking for vintage patterns that either didn't have a Ravelry, weren't in the Ravelry database. And so part of the process of knitting it would be creating the pattern in the Ravelry database, information about the pattern. Or it could be 3 people or fewer had knit it. And so this would be an opportunity to add more project photos. It could be that the pictures were really terrible and you couldn't really see what was going on. It could be any one of those things. And so some of the people who moderate those groups have prizes that they would give out. You wouldn't know what the prizes were ahead of time, and they would just randomly draw a winner from that. I was in a knit along a few years ago that was just happened to occur right at a time I was trying to finish a lot of second socks. I was spending the whole year going through all of my unfinished projects and trying to finish them off. And I had a lot of sock projects where I had only one sock or a part of one sock done. And along came a knit along called a one sock knit along. And the whole idea was, oh, everybody's got a lone sock in their pile of UFOs. And so we're all going to spend the month of June or July or whatever it was getting that second sock finished. And I thought, oh, this is great. I finished something like 7 socks that month. And it was just, and the only reason I joined in, it was like, oh, there's other people who are doing the same thing. It's kind of a fun thing to see other people who are doing the same thing you are, even if it's not exactly the same, it's just related. So this is my understanding of knit-alongs based on a 14-year history that I've had with knitting communities on the internet. But what I've realized is that because I also have this YouTube channel, there are knitters who are not on Ravelry and only are exposed to knitting on the internet through YouTube. And so there's some confusion about what this knit-along actually is. So I'd been talking to a friend of mine about this knit-along when I was in the midst of creating all of the documentation for it and trying to explain it to her. And I explained it to her in a way that made sense to me. Oh, everybody's going to be knitting their sock. They're measuring their own feet and they're going to figure out what their fit issues are. And on August 1st is the start date and everybody will be knitting their own socks. And so she and her husband have a sailboat and they had invited me out to go sailing. And she said, Rox, explain to Corny about the knit-along because I don't think I explained it right. So I explained it. Okay, everybody's going to take their measurements. They're going to figure out where their fit issues are. They're going to take their gauge and they're going to figure out how to knit a sock for themselves using the different elements, different heel and toe that they want, and then it will fit them. And it starts on August 1st. And I said, and I have videos that go along with it. I have a lot of sock videos that go along with it. And there's in my Ravelry group, it's a community of people who follow me and they can ask questions and they can chat with each other and all of that. And they were both like, so when is the live stream then? So like how are you going to do the live stream? And I said, what are you talking about? She says, well, aren't you doing it on your YouTube channel? And I said, well, it's in conjunction with my YouTube. I have all of these technique videos and I'm making more technique videos and I'm talking about it in my Casual Friday videos as well. And they're like, but you're not all like, everybody's not going to tune in at a certain time and you're all going to start it at the same time. And I said, what? No, no. And I thought, oh, it's just because they're non-knitters. I didn't explain to them. They don't understand what a knit-along is. But in the past week or so, it's become clear to me that my friends who are non-knitters are not the only people who don't understand what a knit-along is, and that there was some confusion around what this knit-along was and how it was going to work. So I'm hoping it's understood now that everybody's going to be knitting on their own. We're not knitting together. I'm not knitting on camera with you while you're knitting. That's not what it is. It's I've created reference materials. Some of those are written. Some of those are video format, and the written documentation will tell you if there's a video that's relevant to this that you can watch. I'm going to continue to make more sock technique videos that will be relevant to the knit along. And then on the Ravelry group, that's where you can talk to other knitters just about your project and what you're doing. Or if you have a specific question that you don't understand how to solve a particular fit issue, then there's a way to ask me questions in my Ravelry group. And there's always a link to my Ravelry group down in the description below. Once you are logged on to Ravelry and you're in my Ravelry group, then you'll be able to see a list of discussion threads. If you're really new to the idea of online forums, I would suggest just kind of poking around a little bit and to seeing what there is. But in Ravelry, at the top of the screen, there's always a little question mark, and that's for getting help. So if you don't understand how to navigate around Ravelry, that will help you. So I apologize to those of you who have not been part of a actual online knitting community before and wouldn't have come across the concept of a knit-along. It honestly did not occur to me to explain it in any way other than how I did explain it before, because I just assumed people knew what a knit-along was. So if you are interested in participating in the sock knit-along, it's not too late to join it. But if you've never been in an online community, don't feel like you have to understand everything about what a knit-along is and everything about how to knit the sock and everything all at one time. The knit-along is sort of a rough 6-week period where most of the participants are going to be knitting. I imagine that some people are going to be done very quickly and other people are going to be taking a lot more time. Some people probably won't even start their socks until later in the year because the information that's in the document is not going away, and the videos that are on my YouTube channel are not going away. My Ravelry group is not going away. So anytime you buy any kind of pattern of mine, whether it's an actual step-by-step pattern or whether it's this knit-along documentation, you can always ask questions. That doesn't go away. So what will go away is the number of people who are participating in it at one time and the amount of conversation that might be going on at one time. So far, there's more than 400 people who have bought the knit-along documentation. They come from 6 continents, more than 21 countries. It's really amazing, but not everybody is in that Ravelry group chatting with each other. There's a small segment of some people who are very chatty. There's some people who are asking a question now and then, and some people are never going to make a peep. They won't go to the group, or if they go there, they're only lurking. They're just reading the information. So you can participate in whichever way makes sense for you. I know some people have bought the information and don't plan on using it for months. So there's no rush if you feel like you don't know enough yet about how Ravelry works, or you don't have the time right now to knit a sock. It doesn't matter. So I made a lot of progress on this sweater. I knew this would be a fast knitting sweater just because it's fairly short in the body and it's close fitting, and it's worked with a Aran weight yarn, which is a little bit thicker. So I knew all of those 3 things together would make this a pretty fast knit. So I was able to knit the back and the 2 fronts in the past week. I started this, I think, Friday after I published last week's Casual Friday. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that I faced while I was knitting this, as well as some of the modifications I made, and then all of the times I ripped things out. So the first challenge with the sweater was that it came in only one size, and that is really common with these vintage patterns. They were designed to one size, and it was up to you to figure out how to make them in a different size. This sweater, the size was 32/34. And to fit a 32 to 34, and the actual full circumference was 34 inches. The front band is 2 inches wide, so the actual body of the sweater was 32 inches, and then you'd get an additional 2 inches from the band. So I needed a sweater that was 38 inches, so I needed an extra 4 inches, and the gauge for this sweater is 4 stitches per inch. So I needed to add 16 stitches. That would be 8 for the front and 8 for the back. And the way that I did that was to add 4 stitches, so an inch worth of stitches, to each half of the front and to each half of the back. So this section here had an additional 4 stitches. One of them I added to the underarm. Originally there was an 8-stitch bind off for the underarm, which is a couple of inches, so I added 1 extra stitch there. I added 1 extra stitch to the straight part of the front, not to the button band, but to the straight part of the front. And then I added 2 stitches in the middle here. Now, the effect of adding 2 extra stitches in this part right here is that it would cause me to have to knit an extra 4 rows. For every stitch I added, I would have to add an extra 2 rows, because the way that this shaping is done is with short rows. So after you bind off for the underarm and you work all the way across and you come back, then there are a couple of times where you do a decrease right at the underarm to add a little bit of slope at that edge. But you come across, not all of the stitches, you stop short, and then you turn and you slip the first stitch. That's the short row technique that's being used, is just turning and slipping, and you go all the way back, and then the next time you stop 1 stitch short and you go back, stop 1 stitch short, go back all the way. So by adding 2 stitches, that meant I would have to go back and forth 2 extra times, which is adding 4 additional rows. After I bound off stitches, I worked all the way across and then back. And then I had a couple of rows where I worked a decrease at the beginning, but in the very first row, after I bound off and came back, I worked across to where this marker was, and then I turned. I didn't finish the row, so I worked a short row. I stopped short, I turned, and I slipped that stitch. Then I worked all the way back. I did another decrease here at the edge, and then I stopped 1 stitch before the one where I turned the first time, turned and slipped that stitch and went back. So every time I'm stopping 1 stitch shorter. So these rows are getting shorter and shorter. And all of those stitches where I turned and slipped are being held along the edge like that. So I'm going to keep doing this, working back and forth until I have 2 stitches left. So you can see where this gap is, and then these 2 stitches are right next to each other. So I turn it, because I've turned one here before, so I'm turning after that stitch. I'm turning before I get to that stitch after I've worked this one. And then I turn the work. I slipped that stitch and then I purl back. And the last row is 2 knits. I turn, slip that first one and knit it. And now I have completed all of the short rows. So now I have made this shape. The problem is normally on when you return to working long rows after you've completed your short rows, you would just knit across. But typically you haven't turned so many adjacent rows like this. And because what happens is I have 19 stitches here, and there's if I'm knitting, it's 4 stitches per row. So I have almost 5 inches worth of stitches in terms of if I'm going to knit across, but this is longer than 5 inches. This is 5 inches. I've worked that many rows, but this diagonal is longer than that. And so I'm going to have to, this is where I'm going to be working my yokes. They have a very clever way of dealing with that, of making sure that I don't work across all of these and then have it so cinched together that it wouldn't work. So the instructions are to work those 2 stitches, those last 2 stitches that form the final row, is to work those, and then from then on to pick up the thread in front of the next short row. So they want you have to look at which one of these is sort of on top, and you pick it up like that. Now if I were to let this come over like this, this is actually what a German short row or Japanese short row looks like. And if you wanted to sort of minimize the length of that slip stitch, then you'd work these together. But they don't want to do that. Instead they want this lifted strand right here to be an increase. And so you work it through the back. Make sure I haven't split it. So you work it through the back so that it ends up being like a make one increase. And by creating a twisted stitch, it pulls the extra slack out of that slipped stitch, because slip stitches tend to be elongated. So I'm creating just these extra stitches in between. Okay, and so the last one I'm going to pick up is in the spot where I first turned. So I'm actually picking up a leg of an existing stitch and knitting through there instead. I think that closes it up a little better. And then I just knit all the way across to finish the row. Well, I needed some extra length because not only am I bigger around, I'm a little longer than what the pattern was calling for. It was calling for the total length to be 17 inches, and I just felt like, even though it's supposed to be hitting it the way it would be too short for me. I'm a little taller than average, certainly taller than the average woman would have been in 1938, and my extra height is really in my torso. So I knew that I was going to need a little bit extra length. Now, I showed you last week that I'd done a gauge swatch. I hadn't done a ton of it, and I'd done it in stockinette. So I was getting the correct stitch gauge, and I mentioned that I was surprised that I was only getting 5 rows per inch. I would have expected something closer to 6 rows per inch. And I knew from having calculated out all of the rows that were to be worked for the front, that the gauge would have been 5.8 stitches per, or 5.8 rows per inch, which is close to the 6 that I expected. So I needed extra length in my sweater, but I also needed to add extra stitches, and that was going to give me extra rows. And I was really concerned about how all this was going to be proportioned and how I was going to control for having fewer rows per inch while also needing to add stitches. I couldn't quite figure out what to do. So what I decided to do was go ahead and just work the back up to the armholes, and then see if I could figure out what I was going to do. Well, one of the things that I did was, because my row gauge was different, was that I knit the ribbing for fewer rows. So it called for knitting 20 rows of ribbing, and then row 21 would be where the stockinette started on a right side row. So if row 21 was a right side row, that meant row 1 was a right side row, the row right after the cast on edge. And one thing I like when I use a long tail cast on is for the smooth side of the cast on edge to be on the right side of the work. That means that when I work my ribbing, the first row is a wrong side row. So that means I either need to add an extra row of ribbing or subtract one. So I knit 17 rows of ribbing. I had an odd number, and I knit them a few rows less than the pattern called for in order to help compensate for the extra length I was going to get in the body, just because my row gauge I thought was different. First of all, I was noticing I was getting a slightly different stockinette row gauge when I was actually knitting. It was closer to like 5.3 rows per inch. And then when I worked this garter ridge, everything changed. And that's when I realized, oh, I am getting 5.8 rows per inch. That garter ridge kind of pulls things together, because the purl row wants to come out, and it causes the knit rows to come together. And garter stitch has that effect. I just wasn't thinking that a single row of garter would have that much of an effect, but it is a bulkier yarn. So the good news was that I was getting row gauge, and that meant that when I added a couple of stitches and I got a few extra rows, I would get some extra length that I needed here. It wouldn't be too out of proportion, but it also meant that my ribbing was too short. So I ripped the whole thing out. I hadn't gotten that far on, it was like probably this far in the back. So I ripped it all out, and I started over and I knit 19 rows of ribbing instead of 20 because I didn't want 20. And I knit the back. One of the things I did was I had charted out everything ahead of time. I charted out the original pattern, and then I was trying to decide, well, where am I going to be putting my extra stitches? And so I charted out, I figured it all out for this part of the sweater. And so I knit this whole part, and then I came over to do this part, and I didn't have the right number of stitches. I'm like, what is wrong? And I looked at my chart, and I realized I put all the extra stitches on one, like it was not right. I had to fix my chart. It meant I had to rip this out down to here. So that was my second frogging. So I ripped down to there, I redid it, and then I was able to knit the whole two backs. So the back was done. The next thing I looked at was the instructions for the front. And the instructions for the ribbing on the front were not, had a difference to them that took me a while. I spent some time trying to figure out why is it saying to do this. So the instructions for the front were to cast on, the number of stitches you needed. And then it said, knit all of the stitches of the first row through the back. And then it had me start, I was knitting the right front, I was knitting the buttonholes. So I had started here, it wanted me to knit all of the stitches through the front, the back of the loop, and then it wanted me to start with the garter band. So I knew that row number 2 was a right side row. And then it only wanted me to knit 19 rows of ribbing rather than the 20. So it was having me do something different. And I spent some time trying to figure out why it would have instructions like that. And then I read through the whole pattern again, and there was a general instruction to always knit the stitches of the first row through the back loop. So they had that general instruction, which I hadn't really noted. But then the specific instructions for the back and for the sleeves do not include that instruction. But they repeat that instruction for the two fronts. So I was trying to figure out, why would they want this one to be a row shorter, and why are they having me knit through the backs? And the only thing that I could come up with was that they really wanted the buttonhole to occur, the first buttonhole, which was occurring in the ribbing, to be on, but the bind off to occur on row 12 and the cast on row 13. And then they want the next buttonhole to be on row 24. So this was on row 12, this is on row 24, and then after that, because we're in the main body, they want a buttonhole every 8 rows. They want it in the same position relative to these. And so that was the only thing I could think of, was they had this specific spacing that they wanted here. But if that were the case, why wouldn't they have had me work the back with 19 rows? That was the thing I couldn't figure out. So in the instructions were, if they want the first row to be a right side row on the back, that would mean that at the bottom of all of the knit columns of ribbing, you'd have a purl bump. And that's something I don't want. I want the smooth side of the cast on to face. So my thinking is that in this case, they wanted the first row to be a wrong side row. And so they were having and they wanted there to be purl bumps at the bottoms of these ribbed knit columns. And the way to do that would be to work through, to knit all of the stitches through the back. And they would have you do that rather than just knitting, because if you just knit all of the stitches, that would kind of cause a splay. But if you knit through the backs, you would get a garter ridge coming across. You'd have purl bumps along the bottom, and it would keep things a little tighter, I think. But it seemed to me like a lot of contorting for no good reason. Like I didn't have any problem casting on, working in ribbing all the way across, and then working garter stitch here. it was just a really puzzling thing to me. And I don't, that's the other thing. I don't know if they wanted the buttonhole instructions to be at the beginning of a row instead of the end of the row, and they wanted it to be on the right side. And I don't know. But the only thing I can figure out is that they wanted these two buttonholes to be equidistant, and then all of the ones like that would be a little closer to each other, but they were going to be a regularly spaced thing. But again, they could have just made the back exactly the same as the fronts. So that's a mystery I don't know if I'll ever solve. So once I got past that, and I was working the right fronts, you know, it's interesting. Some things they're very specific and they're telling you, and some other things that I think they're expecting you to do, they don't mention. So I was working the buttonholes, and one of the things that I wanted to do was, instead of binding off on one row and then casting on in the next row, what I wanted to do was a one row buttonhole instead. And so I was doing that. So I was focused on, and I had to remember how to do it because I don't do them very often. Luckily, I made a video on it a while back, so I could go look at my own video and see, to remember the process for getting a good result. So I was focused on doing the buttonhole differently. And the other thing I was focused on was that when I did these garter ridges here, I wanted to keep the selvage stitch where it was going to be seamed. I wanted to keep that in stockinette. So I was focused on those things. And the reason for keeping it in stockinette would be so that it makes the seaming a lot easier. I have a complete nice column of knit stitches, and I can match them up across the rows. You can still match with the garter ridge there, but it would then seam on the inside, then we'll have that little bump. And it's just a little thing that makes things easier for me that nobody else is going to notice, but it makes it easier for me. So I was doing that differently than, the pattern didn't mention doing that. And I was doing my buttonholes a little differently than what was expected. And I didn't think at all about this selvage stitch over here at the edge. And I wasn't loving it. I was just working it in garter stitch. The pattern didn't say to do anything different. I often don't use a slip selvage with garter stitch because a lot of times I think it looks funny. There's other selvage treatments that I prefer if I even think about it, and I wasn't thinking about it. So I got this whole thing done, and I was like, I really don't like the edge because it was garter stitch. And I looked at the pattern photo and I saw that their edge was completely flat right here. And I'm like, oh, they slipped the selvage. And that was probably something that they were assuming was going to happen. So these old patterns, they'll tell you always slip the first stitch of every row, but at the same time, they won't tell you that in an instruction for a particular line. Like it would say knit 8 stitches here, assuming that you're going to slip the first one and then knit the other 7. That's really common, so that you know how many stitches you're working all together, and you're just supposed to know to slip the first stitch. So it's not something I usually do, slipping those stitches. So I decided I ripped the entire right front out and reknit it with the slip selvage, and I do think it looks better. It's just that chunky gauge, I didn't like the garter bump at the edge, and since this is the edge that's going to be lying on top once it's buttoned, I didn't like that. If this had been the button band and I had done that, I would have thought, oh, you know, it doesn't matter so much, I can hide it. I'll just do the slip selvage for the buttonhole band. But since I started with this one, I just decided to redo it. The other challenge I was facing is that the yarn quantity called for in this pattern, it's a specific yarn which has been discontinued for probably 80 or 90 years. It just says 11 ounces of WB quick knit yarn, and WB is William Briggs, so it's their pattern, and they're calling for their yarn. Well, typically when you're using similar yarns in terms of a plied yarn of a certain yarn weight, in general, they're going to have pretty close yardages. Now, it can make a difference if the way that the yarn is, the wool is spun and then the yarn is plied, can make a difference in the yardages that you get. But a lot of times, if it's the same fiber and you think it's the same kind of general yarn, you're going to be able to estimate the same kind of yardages. And this didn't say anything about the yardage. So I looked at that and I thought, okay, I'm going to need, what's 11 ounces? It's about 314 grams. I'll order 400 grams because I do want to make it a little bit bigger. And oh, I added an extra repeat in the body right here. It had called for 5 and I knit 6 to give myself a little night. So I ordered 400 grams. When I'd gotten through the first 100 grams, I realized there's no way I'm going to have enough yarn to make this sweater. And I didn't know how much more I was going to need because I hadn't yet done my complete spreadsheet. I hadn't quite figured out what I was going to do up here, but by that time I got through 100 grams, I did know what my row gauge was, and I knew how I was going to modify the pattern in length and stuff. So then I went through and I calculated all the stitches, and I saw how much more yarn I was going to need. Now I'd ordered this from Webs online, and they, have huge quantities of yarn in given dye lots. So I went on, I saw they still had 25 hanks of this particular color, which I hoped meant that it was still in the same dye lot. So I ordered 5 more 50-gram hanks. So I ordered another 250 grams. I think that's far more than I need, but I didn't want to risk it. So I ordered that. It's going to be in tomorrow. And I did put a note in my special instructions when I ordered, if you have this particular dye lot, that's the one I want. Now, what I do know, so far I've used 300 grams. I have 100 grams left still. It's going to take most of that 100 grams to do the yoke, the ribbed yoke of this. And so the yarn that I get tomorrow will be used for the sleeves. And that's really a good approach if you have a different dye lot for your sweater, is to use those other dye lots in complete pieces rather than switching halfway through the front and where you'd likely get a line. It would be obvious to see. You can use that other dye lot to do something like if you were picking up stitches for button bands, for example, you could use it for that, or you could use it for the sleeves, or you could use it for all of the ribbing or something like that. You do it in places where you're not going to see that obvious difference, or where there's a join, like a seam line here, it's an obvious different piece, and it just isn't going to be as noticeable, if it'll be noticeable at all. So something you guys probably don't know about how I put together my Casual Friday episodes is that I am doing them section by section these days. I used to record all of the different sections of the entire video together, and then I would spend 3 or 4 hours editing the whole thing down. And at that time, I would find out how long the video was. And sometimes I'm pretty good about figuring out how long any particular section is going to be, but not always. And so what I've been doing this summer is I will record one section and then edit it at a time. And it just breaks it up a little bit more easily for me. And then also, if I see that I forgot something, I could record an extra little bit or something like that. So I just finished editing the section that you just saw about this particular sweater. And as I was adding the photograph from the pattern of what the sweater looked like, I realized I may have made a horrible mistake that will cause a complete frogging of my entire sweater. For my World War I sweater, the sweater was the correct bust size for me. It came in one size, just like this one did, but it came in a larger. It was, larger because it was meant to be a little bit looser. It wasn't meant to be form-fitting. And it was long enough that I thought, I probably need to add a little bit to the bottom just for my hips so that the buttons don't pull at it. Because I've had that problem before with a longer sweater where it wasn't quite big enough around the hips. So I did that, and I decreased them down, decreased the extra stitches out, and then knit the whole thing straight up. So I was looking at the photo for this, and remember, I've added 4 inches to this sweater so that it will fit me around the bust. And I'm looking at the pattern photo, and I'm noticing that the model is quite slender, and she's got a little bit of a waist, but she's really not, and her sweater fits her all the way down. And that's when I realized that a 38-inch bust sweater is going to not be form-fitting around me at the bottom. It's going to end up blousing a little bit. And what I should have done was cast on the number of stitches the sweater called for, and then done some increases from the waist going up in order to add the circumference I needed. I think that's what I should have done. I don't know. The next step of the sweater is to knit the yoke, and then it would be, I think, to do the side seams and the sleeves. I'm not sure exactly at what point they're saying to do the side seams, but what I think I'm going to do before I do the yoke is seam up the sides and then try it on and see how it actually fits around me, and whether I like it or not, because I may end up having to rip the whole thing out and starting over from the very beginning. And in that case, I can make some other adjustments if I feel like I need to. So what this means is that it could be that this sweater is not such a quick knit after all. You know, sometimes I realize I do something like this, I think of it as a real boneheaded error, but another times I don't think so. I think it's just part of knitting. Even when you are a really seasoned, experienced knitter, sometimes you don't think about things. I don't often knit a sweater that's this short, so it isn't something I would normally think about. And I do knit longer cardigans, so I do think about my hips. So this just isn't something that I've had to think about before, but I will going forward, that's for sure. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.